The stranger at the door. The scent of freshly baked cinnamon rolls filled the Lawson home as Caroline hummed a soft tune, the kitchen a safe haven where the chaos of the outside world couldn't touch her. She carefully arranged the golden pastries on a ceramic plate, just as she had done countless times before. It was a habit now. A ritual, perhaps. Wednesday afternoons meant baking. They meant warmth and sweetness. They meant consistency. But the moment her front door swung open, all of that changed. "Mom, I'm home." Tommy's voice rang out, bright and carefree, as the door slammed shut behind him. His laughter echoed through the house, bringing with it the lively energy of an ordinary school day. Caroline smiled, wiping her hands on a dish towel before stepping into the hallway. "Welcome back, sweetheart," she called, expecting nothing more than the usual chatter about school, video games, and his latest antics with his friends. But when she saw who stood beside her son, her world tilted off its axis. The boy, he was just a boy, no older than 12, stood slightly behind Tommy, his posture uncertain, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his oversized hoodie. His sneakers were worn, his jeans slightly torn at the knees. But none of that mattered. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. It was his face. The exact face she had memorized, dreamed of, longed for, and grieved over for nearly a decade. Her wooden spoon slipped from her hand and clattered onto the tiled floor. The boy looked up, startled by the sound, his dark brown eyes meeting hers. "Isaiah." It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her mouth, trying to suppress the sob that threatened to escape. The familiar arch of his brows when he was unsure. The soft curve of his cheek. The small crescent-shaped birthmark just behind his ear. It was as though time had rewound. As though her little boy had somehow, impossibly, walked back through her front door. "Mom, what's wrong?" Tawny asked, looking from her to the boy beside him. Confusion etched across his face. Caroline tried to speak, but her voice had vanished, trapped somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming grief. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Lawson." The boy's voice was quiet, careful, the words weighted with uncertainty. "Thanks for letting me come over." It wasn't just his face, it was his voice. A little older, yes, but still carrying the softness, the warmth she had memorized. "Mom, this is Malik," Tommy introduced, not seeming to notice her distress. "He just transferred to my school last week. He's crazy good at Minecraft, and we're about to build the most insane fortress ever. Can we grab some snacks before we head upstairs?" Malik. The name felt wrong, unfamiliar, but it was his eyes that held her captive, wide with something unspoken. Did he know? Did he feel it too? Her knees went weak, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter for support. She struggled, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "Yes, of course. Help yourselves." Tommy, oblivious to the storm raging inside her, grabbed a package of cookies from the counter. "Come on, dude," he said, nudging Malik toward the hallway. But Malik hesitated. His gaze lingered on her for a second too long, his brows drawing together in a way that made Caroline's heart ache. Then, as if shaking off an unseen weight, he followed Tommy down the hall, disappearing into the room that had once belonged to Isaiah. Caroline barely made it to the chair before her legs gave out. The room spun, her hands trembling violently as she pressed them to her chest, as if that alone could contain the storm of emotions threatening to tear her apart. It was him. It had to be him. But how? Where had he been? And why? Why didn't he remember her? The sound of Tommy's laughter drifted down the hall, blending with Malik's softer chuckle. It sent a shiver down her spine. That laugh. It was the same one she had dreamed of. The one that had once filled these walls with joy. Tears blurred her vision as a single thought consumed her. Could this boy truly be her son? And if he was, how had he survived all these years without her? A decade of silence. Caroline's trembling fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled up the old case file on her laptop. the one she had revisited more times than she could count. Isaiah Lawson, missing since April 3, 2013. Last seen playing in the front yard of his home in Brookfield, Ohio. 3 years old at the time of disappearance. Believed to be abducted. Case remains open. The missing child alert had faded into obscurity, just another name among too many. No leads, no evidence, just her shattered world, left with nothing but unanswered questions and a hollow aching grief. Now, nearly 10 years later, here was this boy, her son's mirror image, standing in her home, wearing another name. Malik. She clicked on the police report. A few lines stood out immediately. Child found abandoned at Henderson Park, Cincinnati, Ohio, in June 2013. No identification, no family came forward. Age estimated at 3 years old. Taken into foster care, given the name Malik James. Caroline's breath hitched. 3 years old. Henderson Park. The pieces were aligning too perfectly to be coincidence. A cold, sinking dread pooled in her stomach. Had he been so close all along? Just 2 hours away. Why hadn't they found him? Why hadn't he been returned? Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. If this was Isaiah, if her baby had somehow slipped through the cracks, then someone had failed them both. She closed her laptop with a shaky breath. She needed proof. A DNA test. Something irrefutable. But first, she needed to talk to Malik. And she had no idea how to begin. A scar that time couldn't erase. The next morning, Caroline found Malik sitting at the kitchen table, quietly sipping a glass of milk. Tommy was already outside, racing his bike up and down the street. Now was her chance. Caroline hesitated, then slowly approached. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked softly. Malik nodded, but didn't look up. Her hands tightened around her coffee mug, her pulse hammering. "Malik," she started, forcing steadiness into her voice. Do you remember anything about your life before foster care?" Malik stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening around his glass. "No," he said after a long pause. "Not really." Caroline's throat tightened. Nothing at all. No memories. No flashes off. "No," he cut in sharply, his voice tense. He set his glass down, eyes flickering with unease. "Why are you asking?" Caroline hesitated. How much should she say? Her gaze drifted to the small birthmark behind his ear. Isaiah had had the same one. Her heart clenched painfully. She took a slow breath. "Because I think you might be someone very important to me." Malik's expression darkened. He pushed back from the table abruptly. "I should go. Angela, my foster mom, will be waiting." Caroline's stomach twisted. She didn't want to push him too hard, too fast. But if she let him leave now, would she lose him again? "Malik, wait." Her voice wavered with something raw and desperate. He hesitated at the doorway. "You have a scar," she whispered, her throat tight, "above your right eyebrow. You got it from falling off a swing when you were 2. Malik turned slowly, his expression unreadable. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something heavy. Caroline took a shaky step forward. "Your name isn't Malik," she whispered. "It's Isaiah." His eyes widened, and for the first time, she saw it. The fear, the recognition, the cracks forming in his carefully built walls. Could it really be true? Had her son, her beautiful boy, finally come home? Fragments of the past. The morning air felt heavier than usual, carrying the scent of damp earth from last night's rain. Caroline sat at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, staring at the DNA test kit in front of her. The small, unassuming box held the power to either confirm her deepest hope or shatter it completely. Across from her, Malik sat stiffly, his hands resting on his lap, eyes fixed on the swirls of condensation on his glass of orange juice. His presence in her kitchen felt like a miracle and a cruel joke all at once. Her son, yet a stranger. "You don't have to do this," Caroline said, her voice soft but steady. "But if there's even a small chance that we're connected, I need to know." Malik's fingers twitched. He hadn't spoken much since their conversation the day before, since she had called him by a name that was supposed to belong to him but didn't feel like his, since she had looked at him like he was something fragile, something she was afraid to lose all over again. He hesitated, staring down at the box between them. "I don't know who I am." Caroline felt her breath hitch. His words carried a weight she could barely comprehend. "I thought I did," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I thought I was just some kid no one wanted. I thought I didn't come from anywhere." His fingers curled into a fist against his knee. "But then you look at me like you know me, and that scares me." Caroline swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "I do know you," she whispered. "I just need proof." Malik exhaled sharply, then nodded, the motion slow and reluctant. "Okay." She opened the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out the sterile swab. "It won't hurt, just a quick swab inside your cheek." Malik gave a humorless chuckle. "I've had worse." Caroline flinched, but she didn't ask. "Not yet." She carefully swiped the inside of his cheek and sealed the swab in the plastic vial. It was done. The weight in her chest didn't lighten. Malik sat back, rubbing at his temple as if his thoughts were causing him physical pain. "So, what now?" Caroline exhaled slowly, placing the kit back into its box. "Now we wait." But she wasn't sure she could survive the waiting. Ghosts in the walls. The days passed in slow, agonizing increments. Caroline found herself hyper-aware of Malik's every movement. The way he moved through the house, carefully, like a guest overstaying his welcome. The way he studied the walls as if trying to remember something. The way his fingers hovered over the picture frames in the hallway, but never touched them. Tommy noticed too. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Malik flipping mindlessly through channels while Tommy sprawled on the floor playing with a handheld gaming console, Tommy finally spoke up. "Why do you keep looking at the pictures?" he asked bluntly. Malik stiffened, his fingers freezing on the remote. "I don't know," he admitted. "They feel familiar." Caroline sucked in a sharp breath. Tommy sat up, crossing his legs. "Maybe you do remember. You just don't know it." Malik's jaw clenched. "I don't remember anything." "Are you sure?" Tommy pressed. Malik hesitated. And then, after a long pause, he said, "Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see flashes, like shadows or dreams that don't make sense." Tommy exchanged a glance with Caroline. "Like what?" she asked gently. Malik looked at her, searching her face as if afraid of what he might find there. "There's this sound. Laughing, I think. And a song. Someone singing. A woman." Caroline's breath caught. "Do you remember the melody?" Malik frowned, shaking his head. "Not really. But it makes my chest feel tight, like something is missing." Caroline swallowed hard. "I used to sing to Isaiah every night before bed. A lullaby. The same one my mother used to sing to me." Malik's fingers twitched. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then shut it again. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "That's kinda freaky." Malik let out a dry laugh. "Tell me about it." Caroline wanted to reach for him, wanted to hold him, to tell him it was okay, that he didn't have to remember all at once. But she held back, afraid of pushing too hard. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She started singing. Softly, tentatively, as if the melody itself might break under the weight of this moment. "Hush, my baby, don't you cry. Mommy's here. She'll sing tonight. Close your eyes and dream so high, up into the starry sky." Malik's breath hitched. The room felt impossibly still. And then, to her shock, Malik murmured the next line, barely above a whisper. "Dream of clouds and ocean waves. Dream of love that never fades." His voice faltered at the last word. his throat working as if trying to swallow an emotion too big to name. Tommy's jaw dropped. Malik's eyes were wide, his hands clutching at his jeans. I don't know how I know that," he whispered. Caroline couldn't hold back the tears anymore. "You do know it," she said, her voice shaking, "because I sang it to you every night." Malik's hands curled into fists, his breathing uneven. "I don't understand," he choked out. "I don't remember, but It's okay," Caroline whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to understand it right now. Just know that you were never forgotten, never abandoned. I have been looking for you every single day." Something in Malik's expression cracked, but he quickly turned away, standing up abruptly. I need air." Without another word, he bolted for the back door. Tommy exhaled loudly, running a hand through his hair. That was intense. Caroline wiped at her eyes, forcing a shaky smile. "Yeah, it was." Tommy hesitated. "He's scared, you know." Caroline met her son's gaze. "So am I," she admitted. The unfinished puzzle. Caroline spent the rest of the evening pacing the kitchen, stealing glances out the back window where Malik sat on the patio steps, knees pulled to his chest. He looked small. She hadn't seen him look small before. For years, she had imagined this moment, dreamed of it, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The fragile, broken boy sitting just outside her reach. The boy who was once her son, yet somehow wasn't. Not completely. Not yet. Would he ever be? Her phone vibrated. Her breath caught. The DNA results were in. Her hand shook as she unlocked the screen, her vision blurring as she read the words that changed everything. 99.9% parent-child match. A confirmation. A truth she had already known in her bones, but now had the proof to solidify it. Her legs nearly gave out. Her baby was alive. She pressed a hand over her mouth to keep the sobs from escaping too loudly, her whole body trembling as she leaned against the counter. Through the window, Malik remained on the steps, staring at the sky, completely unaware that, in this moment, the truth of who he was had finally, irrevocably, come home. And now she had to tell him. Now she had to give him back the past he had lost, even if he wasn't ready to accept it. Shattered truths. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and lingering rain as Caroline stood frozen at the kitchen counter, the weight of the DNA results pressing down on her like an invisible force. 99.9% parent-child match. The truth had been written in ink, cold and undeniable. Her son, her Isaiah, was alive. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she gripped the edges of the countertop, trying to steady herself against the tidal wave of emotions. Relief, grief, anger, and an overwhelming, crushing love all swirled inside her, leaving her unsteady. How do you tell someone their entire life has been a lie? Through the back window, she could see Malik still sitting on the patio steps, his arms wrapped around his knees. His dark curls were tousled from the wind, and his posture made him look younger, smaller, like the lost little boy she had once known. A child who had vanished from her world and ended up in another. A child who no longer knew he belonged to her. She exhaled shakily, her fingers trembling as she clenched the printed DNA results in her hands. It's time. The weight of a name. Caroline stepped outside carefully, her footsteps barely making a sound against the worn wooden deck. The glow of the porch light cast a golden hue over Malik's face as he stared blankly at the stars, lost in thought. She hesitated before lowering herself onto the step beside him. Neither spoke for a moment. She watched his fingers trace invisible patterns on the concrete, his breathing slow and measured. I always liked looking at the sky, Malik said suddenly, his voice quiet, distant. I used to think maybe my real parents were up there somewhere, watching. Caroline swallowed, the words hitting her harder than she expected. Your real mother was searching for you, every single day. She took a breath. I got the results back. Malik's hand stilled. He didn't look at her. And her fingers curled around the papers in her lap. You're my son. A long, painful silence stretched between them. Malik let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. I figured. Caroline's breath caught. What? The way you've been looking at me. The way you knew things about me I didn't even know about myself. His voice was heavy with something she couldn't quite name. I knew it before you even said it. She blinked, feeling a fresh wave of tears rising in her chest. Then why did you? Because knowing and accepting are two different things, he muttered, finally turning to face her. His eyes were raw with emotion, filled with a storm of confusion, anger, and something else. Something like grief. My whole life, I thought I didn't matter. I thought I was just another kid dumped into the system. I convinced myself that maybe my parents never wanted me. That I was just forgotten. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. But now you're telling me I wasn't forgotten. That I was stolen. That my whole life has been built on a lie. Caroline's chest tightened as she reached for him, but he flinched away. It's not just that, either, Malik continued, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm himself. If I believe you, if I really let this sink in. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. Then I have to admit that everything I thought I knew about myself isn't real. Caroline's heart clenched painfully. Malik, That's not even my name, is it? He gave her a small bitter laugh, shaking his head. I don't even know my own name. How screwed up is that? Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. She reached out again, slower this time, placing a gentle hand over his clenched fist. You're not a lie, she whispered fiercely. You're my son. No matter what name you've been given, no matter where you've been, that doesn't change. Malik's shoulders trembled, but he kept his gaze locked on the ground. I don't know how to be Isaiah, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline's breath hitched. You don't have to be, she whispered. You can be whoever you choose to be. Malik, Isaiah, whatever name feels right to you. But no matter what, you are my son. His fingers twitched beneath hers. He didn't pull away this time. They sat there in silence, the weight of the truth settling between them. The ruins of a childhood. The following day, Caroline found Malik standing in the hallway, staring at the old photo wall. The frames held frozen moments of a life he couldn't remember, pictures of Isaiah as a toddler, laughing in the backyard, covered in birthday cake, being held in Caroline's arms. His small hands were pressed against the glass, tracing the faces with an almost hesitant reverence. You used to love the swings in our backyard, Caroline said softly, stepping beside him. Every day you'd run outside before I could even put your shoes on. Malik let out a small exhale, his gaze still fixed on the photos. That's the memory I've been seeing, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The swings. The sound of someone singing. Caroline's heart ached. It was me, she whispered, blinking back tears. I used to sing to you while I pushed you. Malik's fingers pressed harder against the glass, as if trying to reach through time itself. I don't know how to do this, he finally said. Caroline turned to him, searching his face. Do what? He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something raw and unfiltered in his eyes. Be someone's son. The confession cracked something deep inside her. She reached out, brushing his curls from his forehead, the way she used to when he was little. He didn't flinch this time. You don't have to figure it all out today, she said softly. We can take it slow. He hesitated. And if I never feel like I belong here. Caroline's throat tightened. Then we'll make it your home. Malik stared at her for a long moment before finally, nodding. It was small, but it was a start. Tommy's breaking point. Not everyone was handling the shift so smoothly. That night, Caroline found Tommy in his room, sitting cross-legged on his bed, his face dark with frustration. "You okay?" she asked, stepping inside cautiously. Tommy exhaled sharply, setting his game controller down. "No." Caroline sighed, sitting beside him. "Talk to me." Tommy's jaw tightened before he finally blurted out, "What if he doesn't want us?" Caroline blinked. "Tommy, of course he wants." "You don't know that," Tommy snapped, his voice rising. "He's different now. He's not Isaiah. He's not even really Malik. He's just lost." Caroline's heart ached at the truth in his words. Tommy shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted a brother, not a stranger." Caroline reached for him, but Tommy stood up abruptly, his back to her. I'm tired of feeling like I'm waiting for someone who isn't sure if they want to stay." Caroline's chest squeezed painfully. "Tommy, just give me time too, okay?" he muttered. And with that, he climbed into bed, pulling the blankets over his head. Caroline stood there, staring at her sons, one downstairs, trying to figure out who he was, and the other upstairs, trying to figure out where he stood. And she wondered how long it would take before the pieces of their broken family finally fit back together. Torn between two worlds, the house felt like a battlefield. Silent, but charged with tension. Caroline could feel it in the way Malik barely touched his dinner, how Tommy pushed his food around his plate without taking a bite. She could feel it in the way both boys kept stealing glances at each other, but never speaking. It was in the way Malik hesitated before stepping inside every day after school, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be here. And it was in the way Tommy didn't bother hiding his frustration anymore. She had expected some tension, expected the growing pains of bringing a lost child back into a home he no longer remembered. But she hadn't been prepared for this. This waiting. Malik was here, but it was like he hadn't fully stepped inside yet. She was trying so hard to be patient, but as she watched him stare blankly at his untouched spaghetti, something inside her cracked. "Malik," she said gently. He didn't look up. Tommy, across from him, crossed his arms. Caroline swallowed hard. "You don't have to say anything, but I need to know. Are you staying?" The question made Malik's fork freeze midair. He blinked, finally lifting his eyes to hers. Tommy scoffed, pushing his chair back. "Forget it, Mom. He's not going to answer." "Tommy." "No," Tommy snapped. His freckled face was red with frustration. "You're just waiting." "For what?" "For him to decide if we're good enough for him." "That's not fair," Caroline whispered. "Isn't it?" Tommy turned to Malik, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You don't even want to be here. You don't want us." Malik stiffened, his jaw clenching. "That's not true." "Then what is?" Tommy shot back. "Because I've been sitting here, waiting for my brother to come home, but you're not acting like him." "I don't remember being him," Malik snapped, pushing his plate away. His voice was sharper now, defensive. "I don't remember this house or you. I don't know how I'm supposed to just become someone else because a DNA test says I should." Tommy flinched, hurt flickering across his face, before he masked it with anger. "Then maybe you should go back to where you came from." Silence. The words landed with the force of a slap. Malik's hands curled into fists, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Caroline's heart stopped. "Tommy." "I'm done waiting," Tommy muttered, grabbing his plate and storming into the kitchen. The sound of the sink turning on was the only thing that filled the air. Caroline turned back to Malik, whose face was carefully blank, but his fingers trembled. His entire body was stiff, like he was bracing himself. Then, without a word, he pushed away from the table and stood. "Where are you going?" Caroline asked, fear creeping into her voice. "I need air." And just like that, he was gone. Caroline watched helplessly as her son, walked out the front door, disappearing into the night. The place between two homes. Malik didn't stop walking until he was halfway down the street. The cold air hit him hard, numbing the parts of him that felt too raw, too exposed. He didn't even know where he was going. It had been like this since the truth came out, since Caroline had given him a name that felt like a ghost inside his own body, since Tommy had started looking at him with something close to betrayal. He felt like he was standing at the edge of two cliffs, unable to jump to either side. One world was the past he couldn't remember, a mother who had spent years searching for him, a brother who had grown up waiting for him to return, a home that wasn't really his anymore. The other was the life he had built for himself, the only life he knew, Angela, his foster home, the memories that actually felt like his, and neither one fit anymore. His feet carried him without thought, and when he looked up, he wasn't surprised to find where he had ended up. Angela's house, his real home, the one he had known for years, the one that had kept him safe when no one else had. His heart pounded as he hesitated on the doorstep, staring at the familiar blue door. It felt right. Familiar. He knocked. Seconds later, the door opened, and Angela's face appeared, lined with exhaustion. Her eyes widened in shock. Malik. He swallowed hard. Hey. A beat of silence passed before she pulled him into a tight hug, one hand smoothing over his curls the way she always did. The tension in his chest unraveled just a little. I was so worried, she whispered. Why didn't you call? I don't know, he admitted, his voice cracking. She pulled back, studying his face. Her eyes softened. You ran away, didn't you? He looked away. I don't know if I belong there. Angela's sigh was heavy, filled with understanding. Come inside, she said gently. Torn between two mothers, the warmth of Angela's house wrapped around Malik like a blanket. Everything felt the same. The scent of vanilla from the candle she always kept on the kitchen counter, the faint hum of the heater in the background, the soft, worn couch where he had spent so many nights curled up watching TV. It felt like home. So why did he still feel so lost? Angela sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Talk to me, she said softly. Malik stared down at his lap. I feel like I'm supposed to be someone I don't remember. Angela nodded slowly. That's a lot to carry. He exhaled shakily. It's like everyone's waiting for me to turn into this kid they lost. But I don't know how to be him. I don't know how to be Isaiah. You don't have to be him, Angela said gently. Malik looked up, startled. She smiled sadly. You are still you. You are the boy I raised. The boy who leaves his socks everywhere and eats all the good cereal before anyone else gets a chance. Malik huffed out a small laugh despite himself. Angela reached across the table, placing a warm hand over his. It's okay to love her, Malik. It's okay to love them. It doesn't mean you're leaving me behind. His throat tightened. Then why does it feel like it does? Angela's gaze softened. Because love is messy. They sat there in silence, Malik gripping her hand like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. After a long pause, he whispered, I don't know if I can go back. Angela squeezed his fingers gently. That's your choice. But just remember, running from something doesn't mean you're running to something else. His chest ached. Angela let go, leaning back in her chair. But if you want my advice. He nodded. She gave him a small, knowing smile. Go home. A choice only he could make. It was past midnight when Malik stood outside the Lawson house again. The windows were dark, the only light coming from the porch. His fingers hovered over the door handle. The weight of everything pressed against his chest. Go home. He wasn't sure where that was anymore. But he knew he had to figure it out. With a slow, shaky breath, he knocked. A few seconds passed before the door creaked open. Caroline stood there, her eyes tired, her expression unreadable. But when she saw him, something in her face broke. Malik. His throat was dry. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline exhaled shakily. Neither do I. A pause. Then, in the quietest voice, she asked, Are you coming home? Malik hesitated. then nodded, and stepped inside. The road to belonging. Caroline stepped aside, her hands trembling as Malik walked past her into the dimly lit house. The air felt thick, weighted with all the unspoken words between them. He stood in the middle of the living room, shoulders hunched, his eyes darting around like he was seeing the space for the first time, or maybe for the 100th time in a life he couldn't remember. Caroline swallowed past the lump in her throat. "You hungry?" she asked softly, trying to sound normal. Malik shook his head, but the way his fingers twitched at his sides told her he wasn't sure what to do with himself. "Tommy's asleep," she added, glancing toward the stairs. He was upset earlier." Malik stiffened. "I get it," he muttered. Caroline exhaled slowly, walking past him to the couch and sitting down. She patted the spot next to her. "Will you sit with me?" For a moment, she thought he would refuse. But then, hesitantly, he sank onto the couch, his movements stiff, like he wasn't sure if he should really be here. Silence stretched between them, the hum of the fridge in the background the only sound. Finally, Caroline reached for the coffee table, pulling out an old photo album with slightly worn edges. "This was your favorite," she murmured, running a hand over the cover before flipping it open. Malik tensed beside her, but his eyes flicked down. The first page held a hospital photo, a tiny, wrinkled newborn with soft curls and sleepy brown eyes. A name was written in faded ink beneath it, Isaiah James Lawson. Malik inhaled sharply. Caroline turned the page. There was a picture of a chubby baby sitting on a picnic blanket, his hands covered in birthday cake. Another of him splashing in a kiddie pool in the backyard, and then one with Tommy, still a toddler himself, sitting beside him in a pile of autumn leaves, both boys laughing as their mother's shadow stretched over them. Malik's fingers twitched at his sides. He looked at the pictures, but she could tell he wasn't just seeing them. He was searching for something inside himself. Finally, his hand lifted hesitantly, his fingers brushing against one of the pages. "I don't." His voice faltered, and he clenched his jaw. "I don't remember any of this." His tone was almost apologetic, and it broke Caroline's heart. She reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "That's okay." Malik's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His gaze lingered on the image of his younger self, the life he had before everything was stolen from him. His voice was barely above a whisper when he asked, Did I like books?" Caroline's heart clenched. "You loved them," she whispered. "Every night, I had to read at least 3 before you'd even think about falling asleep. You used to drag them all into bed with you, too. I'd have to dig through the blankets to find you under all those pages." Malik let out a quiet, breathy chuckle. "Sounds like me." She squeezed his hand again. "Because it is you." His fingers curled slightly against hers, his body slowly, barely, unraveling some of the tension he'd been carrying. They sat like that for a long time, flipping through the pages of a childhood he couldn't remember, yet somehow, deep down, felt. And even though he didn't say it out loud, Caroline could see it in his eyes. Somewhere, deep inside him, a part of him recognized this place. Maybe not fully, maybe not yet, but it was a start. Tommy's walls. The next morning, Caroline woke up to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of soft shuffling in the kitchen. She rolled out of bed, running a hand through her hair as she padded down the stairs. In the kitchen, Malik stood at the counter, staring at the coffee pot like it was a foreign object. "Morning," she greeted gently. He glanced up at her, hesitating. "Hey." She noted the dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept much. Still, he was here. That meant something. I don't really know how to make coffee," he admitted. Caroline's lips twitched in amusement. "You want to learn?" He shrugged. "Sure." She stepped beside him, walking him through the steps, her hands guiding his as he scooped the coffee grounds, measured the water. It was such a simple moment, one that would have been normal in another lifetime, and yet it meant everything. As the coffee brewed, The sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his eyes flicking between them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Tommy sighed and walked to the fridge, grabbing a juice box. "Morning," Caroline tried. Tommy just nodded, leaning against the counter. Malik shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the countertop. Then, quietly, he muttered, "Sorry." Tommy blinked, clearly caught off guard. "For what?" Malik exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "For leaving last night. For not knowing how to do this." Tommy watched him for a long moment, sipping his juice. Then, finally, he shrugged. "It's whatever." Malik flinched slightly at the words, but Caroline noticed how Tommy's gaze softened, just a little. Then Tommy sat at the table, opening a pack of Pop-Tarts and munching on them absent-mindedly. "I mean, you're back now, right?" Malik hesitated. Caroline held her breath. Then, softly, uncertainly, Malik said, "Yeah." Tommy chewed, watching him. Then, as if making a very casual decision, he held out a half of his Pop-Tart. Malik hesitated for half a second before taking it. Caroline let out a quiet breath of relief. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was something. And right now, something was enough. The first real step. Later that afternoon, Malik sat on the edge of his new bed, staring at the half-unpacked suitcase in front of him. His fingers curled into the fabric of his hoodie as he glanced around the room. His room. It still felt foreign, like a place borrowed instead of owned. But as he looked at the books Caroline had placed on the shelf for him, the blanket she had bought in his favorite color, the framed photo she had put beside his bed, the one of him and Tommy from when they were babies, it felt a little less foreign. A soft knock on the door made him look up. Caroline peeked in. "Hey. Hey." She hesitated before stepping inside, holding out a small, well-loved teddy bear. Malik blinked at it. "What's that?" "You had it when you were little," she said softly, sitting beside him. "It was your favorite. You named it Pancake." Malik snorted. "That's a dumb name." Caroline smiled. "You were 3. A pause. Then, hesitantly, he took it from her. It felt familiar. His chest ached. Caroline reached over, squeezing his hand. "Welcome home." Malik swallowed hard, staring down at the bear. Then, barely above a whisper, he murmured, "Yeah, I think it is." Breaking the walls, building a home. The autumn air was crisp as Malik walked to school beside Tommy, the dried leaves crunching beneath their sneakers. The streetlights still hummed softly from the early morning chill, and the sky was painted with streaks of pink and orange. It had been a week since he'd decided to stay. A week of cautious movements, of figuring out where he fit into this house, this family, that he still wasn't sure was his. A week of trying to belong. Tommy had been better. They weren't best friends overnight. There were still moments of tension, moments where Tommy hesitated before speaking, where Malik felt the weight of the uncertainty in the air. But things were shifting. And maybe that was enough. For now. "Coach said we might make the finals this year," Tommy said, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets. Malik nodded, adjusting his backpack strap. "Yeah." Tommy grinned. "Yeah, you should come watch." Malik blinked, surprised. "Me?" Tommy scoffed. "Duh, you're part of the family, right?" Something in Malik's chest tightened. "Yeah," he muttered, the word tasting unfamiliar, but not wrong. "I guess I am." An unfinished story. After school, Malik lingered in the doorway of his room, staring at the half-unpacked boxes that still sat against the walls. He'd been avoiding them. He knew that unpacking meant accepting this as home. That scared him more than he was willing to admit. A knock on the door made him jump slightly. He turned to see Caroline standing there, holding a small, dusty notebook. "I found this in the attic," she said softly, stepping inside. "It was yours." Malik frowned as she handed it to him. It was an old composition notebook, its pages yellowed at the edges. The cover was decorated with faded stickers, planets, stars, tiny drawings of rockets and spaceships. He ran his fingers over them, something warm curling in his chest. "You loved space when you were little," Caroline murmured, watching him closely. Malik swallowed. I still do." A soft smile tugged at her lips. "I know." He hesitated, then flipped open the notebook. The first few pages were filled with messy crayon drawings, rockets blasting off, aliens waving, stick figures with big grins labeled me and Mom. His breath hitched slightly. Then, further in, there were words. Stories, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. A small gasp left his lips. "I wrote these." Caroline nodded. "You always told me you were gonna be the first kid to land on Mars." Malik let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. Wow. For the first time, the memories didn't feel like something distant, like something someone else had lived. They felt like his. Caroline placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You don't have to remember everything right now," she whispered. "But you don't have to be afraid of it, either." Malik stared at the notebook, his fingers brushing over the words. Then, hesitantly, he whispered, "Can I keep it?" Caroline smiled. "It's always been yours." The edge of a brother's heart. Later that night, Malik found Tommy in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a bag of chips beside him. "Want to play?" Tommy asked, holding up a video game controller without looking up. Malik hesitated. Tommy rolled his eyes. "Dude, just sit down." Malik smirked and plopped onto the couch. "Fine." The game loaded, some kind of racing battle, fast-paced and chaotic. They played in silence for a while, their fingers moving rapidly over the buttons, the TV filling the space with explosions and cheers. Then, after a particularly close race, Tommy spoke. "You know I didn't mean it, right?" Malik's fingers tightened around the controller. "Mean what?" Tommy's eyes flicked to his. "What I said that night. That you should go back." Malik swallowed. "I was just mad," Tommy muttered. "I didn't mean it." Malik studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "I was thinking about leaving anyway." Tommy flinched slightly, like the words hurt. "But I didn't," Malik added. Tommy let out a breath. Good. They didn't say anything else. But when Tommy nudged him a little too hard during the next round, and Malik shoved him back with a smirk, something felt lighter. Like a wall had finally cracked just enough to let something real slip through. A place to call home. A few days later, Malik finally unpacked. He didn't rush it. He took his time, running his fingers over every item, every piece of clothing, every book that Caroline had gotten for him. And when he finished, he stood in the center of the room, looking around. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was his. His bed, his books, his shelves, his home. And for the first time since stepping into this house, he let himself believe it. Caroline appeared in the doorway, a hopeful look in her eyes. "Well?" she asked softly. Malik let out a slow breath. Then he smiled. "It's home," he said. And for the first time, he meant it. A name that fits. The late autumn breeze carried the scent of burning leaves through the open window of Malik's room. It was the kind of crisp air that signaled the start of the holiday season, the kind that made everything feel a little bit warmer inside. Malik sat on his bed, flipping through the old notebook Caroline had given him. The pages were filled with the words of a boy who had once dreamed of space, of rocket ships, of being the first kid to land on Mars. He didn't remember writing any of it, but when he read the words, he could feel something. A flicker of familiarity, a piece of himself, buried under years of not knowing who he was. His fingers traced the messy, uneven handwriting. Isaiah. It was written on every page. His name. His real name. And yet, it didn't feel like his. Not completely. It was a name from a past he couldn't remember. a name that belonged to a little boy who had been lost for almost 10 years. He wasn't that boy anymore. But he also wasn't just Malik. He was something in between. Unpacking the truth. Downstairs, Caroline was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for what she had proudly declared would be the best homemade apple pie ever. Malik had his doubts. She was humming softly to herself, her movements light, easy. For the first time since he'd arrived, she looked at peace. "Need help?" he asked, stepping inside. Caroline turned, her face brightening instantly. "You offering?" He shrugged. "Might as well. Not like I've got anything better to do." She grinned. "Grab an apron, astronaut." He hesitated, surprised at the nickname. Astronaut. It had slipped from her mouth naturally, like a habit she had never quite broken. Something in his chest tightened. He grabbed an apron, tying it around his waist. "So, what do I do?" Caroline handed him a bowl of sliced apples. "Toss these in cinnamon and sugar while I roll the crust. If it's too sweet, Tommy will eat the whole thing before it even bakes." Malik smirked. Noted. As he worked, he found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it, mixing the apples, the scent of cinnamon filling the air, the warmth of the kitchen making him feel settled in a way he hadn't before. It was nice. Normal. He had never really thought about what normal felt like before, but maybe it felt like this. Tommy's deal. Later that night, Malik found Tommy sitting on the back porch, tossing a football in the air and catching it absent-mindedly. For the past few days, things between them had been better. They weren't best friends yet, but the tension had lifted enough that Tommy didn't look at him like he was a stranger anymore. Malik sat down next to him. Tommy didn't say anything at first. Then, without looking at him, he muttered, "So, you're staying for real this time, huh?" Malik exhaled. "Yeah." Tommy nodded. "Good." A pause. Then he turned, his expression unusually serious. "But if you ever leave again, I get to punch you. Just once. For real." Malik snorted. "Deal." Tommy grinned, then shoved his shoulder playfully. And just like that, something clicked into place between them. The name that chose him. A few days later, Caroline sat across from Malik in the living room, a legal document in front of her. The official adoption papers. His hands felt weirdly heavy as he looked down at them. "All that's left is your signature," Caroline said softly. Malik swallowed. He wanted this. He knew he wanted this. But when his eyes landed on the name printed at the top of the form, Isaiah James Lawson, he hesitated. "Do I have to use that name?" he asked quietly. Caroline's brow furrowed. "Do you not want to?" Malik shifted in his seat. "I don't know. I mean, I get that it's my real name, but I don't feel like Isaiah." Caroline studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then don't be." Malik blinked. "What?" She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I named you Isaiah because I loved it, because it felt right at the time. But names don't just belong to us. We have to belong to them too." Malik swallowed past the lump in his throat. "You can be whoever you choose to be," she continued. "If you want to stay Malik, then you'll stay Malik. If you want to be Isaiah, then you'll be Isaiah. Or if you want something in between, that's okay too." He looked down at the paper, at the name. Then, without thinking too much, he grabbed the pen. And next to the printed name, in bold, sure letters, he signed, "Malik Isaiah Lawson." Belonging, at last. The first snow of the season fell that night. Malik stood outside, watching the flakes drift down, covering the street in a soft, quiet blanket of white. The Lawson house behind him was filled with warmth. Caroline humming as she cleaned up the kitchen, Tommy yelling at the TV as he played a video game. For the first time in a long time, Malik didn't feel like he was floating between two lives. He felt grounded, settled, home. He closed his eyes, inhaling the cold air deeply. And when he whispered his name, his real name, It didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like his. "I'm home," he murmured. And this time, he knew it was true.